Today we're really going into some dark territory. The subject is war.
Mm-hmm.
But not the way it's often presented. We're going deep into the unsettling stuff, the genetics, evolution, psychology, what happens in the brain, even anthropology.
Yeah, and we'll be drawing on quite a range, from thinkers like Clausewitz and Hobbes, right up to modern insights from people like Žižek, Sapolsky, and looking at how art reflects this darkness. Think Homer, Picasso, even films like The Pianist.
Exactly. It's going to be heavy, fair warning. This isn't about easy answers. It's about understanding something profoundly difficult about humanity.
And we've sifted through a lot. Philosophy, science, history, art. The idea is to pull out the core insights, the really thought-provoking, sometimes uncomfortable truths.
Sort of a concentrated dose of the grim reality behind the headlines. So, okay, let's start right there. What is war, fundamentally? Is it just, politics failing? Or is it something prime?
Well, you get stark answers depending on who you ask. Clausewitz famously called it politics by other means, tool, essentially.
Right, a rational, if brutal, extension of state policy.
But then you look at someone like Hobbes, and it's completely different. He saw the natural state of humanity without strong authority as a war of every man against every man, life as just, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Pure survival.
Yeah, bleak.
It is. And Thucydides, writing about the Peloponnesian War ages ago, he saw it driven by power dynamics, by human nature, ambition, fear, the million dialogue he recounts. It's basically the strong saying to the weak, we do what we want, you accept what you must. Pure, real politics.
So is that it? Or are we just hardwired for this? People talk about a warrior gene.
Mm-hmm.
Is there actually like a biological push towards conflict?
The warrior gene. It usually refers to variations in the MAOA gene. The science is, it's complex. It's not a simple switch that makes someone aggressive.
Right.
Some studies, like Professor Han Brenner's work initially highlighted, suggest certain low-activity variants might be linked to increased aggression. But crucially, it seems to be magnified by things like childhood trauma. It's a gene-environment interaction.
So not destiny, but maybe a predisposition under certain difficult circumstances.
Exactly. It's not deterministic. And evolutionary psychology throws in ideas like the male warrior hypothesis. The theory goes that males evolved tendencies for forming coalitions, groups, to fight violently over resources, mates, that kind of thing.
And they point to chimps.
Right. Chimpanzees show behaviors like coordinated patrols, even lethal raids on neighbors. Richard Wrangham talks about this imbalance of power idea, basically, attacking when you know you can win easily with minimal risk. It's unsettlingly familiar sometimes.
Yeah, that is sobering. But surely it's not all just biology. Culture has to play a massive role, right?
Right.
War seems so organized.
Oh, absolutely. That's a major counterargument. Many anthropologists and historians argue that large-scale organized warfare is actually quite recent. Maybe tied to agriculture, settling down, having resources to fight over.
So not something we've always done.
The evidence for widespread, constant warfare way back in prehistory is pretty debated. And you just have to look at the incredible diversity of human cultures. Some are far more peaceful than others. It shows how much is learned, how much is cultural norm. Plus, some argue that even the chimp violence might be partly influenced by human disruption of their habitats.
Okay, so biology might set a stage, but culture writes a lot of the script.
A good way to put it, it's an interplay.
Which leads us inside our heads. What's going on neurologically? What makes us capable of wartime behavior?
The brain is key, obviously. You've got the amygdala, think of it as the brain's threat detector, firing up fear and aggression responses really fast.
The primal bit.
Kind of, yeah. And then there's the prefrontal cortex, the more evolved part, which is supposed to handle reasoning, impulse control, trying to keep the amygdala in check. Supposed to.
Right. And hormones are swirling around too. Testosterone often gets linked to aggression, though it's complex. Low serotonin can make impulse control harder. Cortisol, the stress hormone, floods the system.
And oxytocin, isn't that the love hormone?
It is, but it has a dark side. It boosts bonding and trust within your group, your other's ease. But studies, like those Sapolsky discusses, show it can also increase suspicion and hostility towards the them, the outgroup. It draws lines.
Wow. So the same hormone that bonds us can also help divide us for conflict.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
And don't forget dopamine, the reward system. Dominance, enforcing group norms, even aggression in certain contexts can trigger dopamine release. It can feel good in a disturbing way.
And to make violence easier on a mass scale, you need dehumanization, right? Seeing the enemy as not human.
Absolutely essential.
Yeah.
Nick Haslam, a psychologist, talks about two main types. There's animalistic dehumanization, seeing the enemy as savages, beasts, vermin. Wartime propaganda is full of this caricatures of the enemy as rats or apes. It strips away their higher human qualities, makes them seem primitive, dangerous.
Exactly. And then there's mechanistic dehumanization. That's seeing them as objects, machines, cogs without feelings or individuality, like they're just obstacles or tools. Both forms make it psychologically easier to harm or kill.
It overrides empathy.
It short-circuits it.
This psychological dimension. It reminds me of those experiments like Milgram's.
The obedience experiments, yeah.
Uh-huh.
They're chilling, showing how ordinary people could be pressured by authority into inflicting what they thought was terrible pain on others.
It wasn't necessarily sadists doing it.
No. It points towards the power of the situation, of authority. It makes you think about atrocities like Melee or even the Holocaust, how seemingly normal people could participate in horrific acts when obeying orders within a certain structure. That us versus them mentality is foundational.
That in-group loyalty, out-group hostility thing again. Sapolsky talks about that with oxytocin too, doesn't he? How easily we form tribes.
He does. It seems to be a very deep-seated tendency in us, this quick division of the world into us and them, favoring our own and distrusting, even vilifying the other. It's fertile ground for conflict.
Given all this potential for violence, this psychology, how have societies tried to control or justify war? I'm thinking of things like just war theory.
Right. Just war theory is a major attempt to put ethical boundaries around war. It has two parts, basically. Just ad bellum, the justice of going to war. That involves criteria like having a just cause, legitimate authority, right intention, a reasonable chance of success, proportionality, the good must outweigh the harm, and it being a last resort.
Sounds reasonable on paper.
It does. Then there's jus in bello justice in war. Rules for conduct during fighting, like discrimination only targeting combatants, not civilians, and proportionality again, avoiding excessive force and military necessity.
Critics would say it's easily manipulated, right? Or that modern war makes these rules almost impossible to follow.
That's exactly the criticism. Who decides what's a just cause? How do you maintain discrimination with modern weapons? Some argue it's become a way to legitimize wars that shouldn't happen, or that it's simply a fantasy in the face of today's conflicts.
And the alternative is pacifism, just rejecting war entirely.
Broadly, yes. You have absolute pacifists who believe violence is always wrong, and contingent pacifists who might allow for violence in very specific, extreme self-defense scenarios, but generally argue that the immense destruction of modern war can never be justified.
It leads to this strange paradox, doesn't it? Hobbes argued you need a power capable of overwhelming force, capable of war, precisely to prevent constant war.
The Leviathan, yeah. The idea that only a strong state can keep the peace. And that feeds into deterrence theory, the idea of peace through strength, or even peace through the threat of mutual annihilation, like during the Cold War.
Which sounds dangerously close to Orwell's 1984, War is Peace.
Exactly. Orwell saw how perpetual low-level conflict could be used as a tool for social control, keeping the population united against an external enemy and consuming resources.
Chilling. How do these ideas compare globally? Do other traditions see conflict differently? Sun Tzu, for instance?
Sun Tzu's Art of War is fascinating because it's all about strategy, intelligence, knowing your enemy and yourself, and crucially, the highest skill is winning without fighting. Avoiding direct conflict, if possible.
Very different from Clausewitz, perhaps.
In emphasis, yes. And then you have Kautilya's Arthashastra from ancient India. It acknowledges the law of the fish, Matsya Nyaya, the big fish eat the little fish, seeing conflict as somewhat inevitable in politics, but also incredibly costly. So war is a tool, but absolutely a last resort after diplomacy and other means fail.
What about religious perspectives? Jihad, for example.
The concept of jihad in Islam is often misunderstood. It primarily refers to the greater jihad, which is the internal struggle against one's own base impulses. The lesser jihad can involve external struggle, potentially armed conflict, but traditionally comes with very strict rules of engagement, protecting civilians, property, the environment. Extremist groups obviously twist this entirely.
And on the other end, you have concepts like ahimsa.
Right. Ahimsa nonviolence is central to traditions like Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism. It comes from a place of deep compassion and recognizing the interconnectedness of all beings. Violence harms everyone. Though even within Hinduism, you have texts like the Mahabharata exploring the idea of a righteous war, Dharma Yuddha, but delving deep into the moral ambiguities and immense suffering involved.
It seems like across cultures, there's this wrestling with the necessity, the horror, and the morality of war.
Definitely. And nowhere is that wrestling more vivid, perhaps, than in art.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier. How has art served as this dark mirror to war?
It's incredibly powerful. In literature, you go back to Homer's Iliad. It's full of heroic battles, yes, but it's also unflinching about the brutality, the grief, the sheer waste of life. Fast forward thousands of years, and Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front just devastates you with its portrayal of a generation utterly destroyed by industrial warfare. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland captures that post-WWI sense of disillusionment and fragmentation.
And visually.
It's a real spectrum. You mentioned traditional Chinese painting, often avoiding war, focusing on harmony. Compare that to some Japanese ukiyo-e woodblock prints, which were used for wartime propaganda, glorifying battles.
Right.
In the West, there's a clear evolution. Early on, you get some glorification, like Uccello's stylized battle scenes or Velázquez's surrender paintings. But then Goya, his 3rd of May, 1808, is just raw horror, the fear, the execution. It's a turning point.
And Picasso's Guernica.
The ultimate statement on the terror of modern aerial bombing. Just chaos and suffering. And someone like Kate Kollwitz, her work is heartbreaking, focusing relentlessly on the grief, the loss, the impact on women and children left behind. It's devoid of heroism, full of pain.
And films like The Pianist you mentioned. They bring that individual suffering into sharp focus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They force you to confront the human cost on an intimate level, stripping away any abstract justifications. Music, too, composers like Beethoven or Shostakovich writing pieces during or reflecting on wartime, capturing that turmoil and dread.
It's like art refuses to let us look away from the ugliest parts.
It holds up that mirror, yeah. Sometimes it's accusatory, sometimes lamenting, but rarely indifferent once you get past the purely propagandistic stuff.
Bringing us closer to the present. How does technology change the picture? Video games, for instance. They often simulate war.
That's a huge area. Games like Call of Duty are massively popular. Critics argue they can glorify conflict, maybe desensitize players, acting as a form of manufacturing consent for military action. Psychologists talk about the general aggression model, how exposure might increase aggressive thoughts or behaviors, though it's debated.
But not all games are like that.
No. You have games like This War of Mine, which flips the script entirely, putting you in the shoes of civilians struggling to survive during a war. It's harrowing. It forces ethical choices far removed from typical shooter games. You could even apply just war theory concepts to analyze the ethics within game narratives.
And then there's the technology of war itself.
Yeah.
Autonomous weapons, killer robots.
Lethal autonomous weapon systems, LWSs. Yeah, that's a major ethical minefield. The big questions are about meaningful human control. Should a machine make the kill decision? Accountability, who's responsible if an autonomous weapon makes a mistake or commits a war crime? And can these systems truly comply with the laws of war, like distinguishing civilians from combatants or judging proportionality?
Where are we with that now? Is it happening?
There's a lot of development. The U.S. Department of Defense has Directive 3000.09, which sets policy emphasizing human judgment. But the technology is advancing rapidly, and there are ongoing international discussions, debates about bans or regulations. It's a really pressing issue.
And cyber warfare. That seems like a whole different battlefield.
It is. Attacks on critical infrastructure, power grids, hospitals, financial systems. The lines are incredibly blurred. Who is a combatant online? How do you attribute attacks reliably? Applying just war principles like discrimination or proportionality becomes extremely difficult in cyberspace. It's messy and dangerous.
Not to mention space.
The weaponization of space is another looming threat. Anti-satellite weapons tests create debris fields that endanger everyone's satellites. There's talk of a potential arms race in space, which could make critical infrastructure, communication, navigation systems we rely on incredibly vulnerable.
It feels like the nature of conflict is constantly shifting, becoming more complex, maybe more insidious.
Which brings us back to thinkers who look at the systemic side of things. You mentioned Žižek earlier.
Right, his idea about different kinds of violence.
Exactly. He distinguishes between subjective violence, the direct, visible acts of crime and terror, the stuff we see in war, and objective violence. This objective violence is quieter, more systemic.
Like poverty, discrimination.
Yes, the violence inherent in certain economic or political systems. Symbolic violence embedded in language. Žižek argues this objective violence is the background noise that often enables the eruption of subjective violence. We focus on the explosion, but ignore the conditions that made it possible.
That connects a bit with Orwell, too. The idea of systems perpetuating conflict.
And someone like Foucault adds another layer with biopower, how modern states manage populations, making live and letting die. He argued this can flip into actively killing when certain groups are deemed a threat to the population's health or security. State racism, he said, becomes a tool for deciding who lives and who dies, enabling massive violence within this logic of protecting the population.
So the state's power to nurture life also contains the power to take it on a mass scale, if groups are framed as threats.
That's the disturbing implication.
And finally, how do we even remember all this?
Yeah.
How does society process war after the fact?
That's the battlefield of memory. Collective memory isn't just accurate recall, it's a social construction. It's shaped by media, by monuments, by school textbooks, by political speeches.
Like how World War I is remembered differently in Britain versus Germany.
Precisely. There are competing national narratives, different lessons learned, different traumas emphasized. Or think about the Vietnam War in the U.S., the debates, the veteran narratives, the films like Apocalypse Now or Platoon. They all shape how that war is understood and its legacy felt today. How we tell stories about past wars profoundly impacts our present identity and how we approach the possibility of future conflict.
So after going through all of this, the biology, the psychology, the systems, the art, the memory, where does it leave us? Are we just doomed to keep doing this? Is war inevitable?
Look, the picture is undeniably dark. Our biology might give us certain potentials for aggression and tribalism. Our psychology makes us susceptible to fear, obedience, and dehumanization. Our social and political systems can create objective violence and justify subjective horrors. Technology offers ever more efficient ways to kill. It's a lot.
It feels overwhelming.
It can, but ignoring it doesn't help. The point of this deep dive, I think, is that understanding these dark currents is crucial. Recognizing the psychological traps, the systemic pressures, the allure of technology, the way narratives are shaped, maybe that is where the hope lies.
Hope through understanding the darkness.
Perhaps. Understanding it doesn't excuse it, but it might help us guard against it. Recognizing our own capacity for these things, individually and collectively, might be the first step toward consciously choosing differently, towards building systems that mitigate rather than exacerbate these tendencies. It's not easy, but maybe it's possible.
A sobering thought to end on, but maybe a necessary one. This has been, well, quite a journey into the heart of war's complexities. Our biology, our minds, our societies, our creations, all tangle up in this cycle.
It really is a tangle. And maybe the final question we leave you, the listener, with is this. Given everything we've touched on, all the unsettling realities, what responsibility do you feel in navigating a world still so deeply marked by conflict? What actions, even small ones, might stem from understanding this darkness?